Everybody. I am Leah M. Forney. I'm an underserved populations policy advocate here at MCASA, and so I'm super excited to be before you all to teach you about culturally informed care, especially with working with BIPOC and Indigenous communities that are impacted by sexual assault. So the purpose of this training really is to help empower those who work with survivors of sexual assault. So whether that's college and university staff, advocates, counselors, the purpose of this training is really to provide you with the knowledge and skills necessary to provide compassionate, culturally sensitive, and trauma-informed support to our survivors of sexual assault. It is also the purpose is to deepen your understanding about the unique challenges that survivors in BIPOC and Indigenous communities face when it comes to reporting or not reporting. It's also my hope that by the end of this training, we'll have a clear understanding on how we can address intersectionality, cultural stereotypes, biases, and tailor our support so that we are supporting their individual needs while respecting their cultural autonomy and their sovereignty, especially within Indigenous communities. So it is my goal that we begin to have conversations that foster a culture of survivors being heard, understood, and provide that culturally informed care that they deserve. So some of the objectives that I want to touch on throughout this training is one, cultural sensitivity and humility. Probably in the last few years, we've kind of moved away from just being culturally competent to now focusing on getting an understanding on how we should be responding to the unique needs of those in BIPOC and Indigenous communities. Also, to talk a little bit about intersectionality and how that plays a role, right, when we're supporting these survivors, making sure that we are fostering inclusive and sensitive and diverse services for them. We're going to talk a little bit about trauma-informed practices. So how do we make sure that we're responding with a trauma-informed approach? We're going to touch on some biases and stereotyping. So how do we ensure that we are offering guidance that is going to be avoiding of cultural stereotypes and biases, but be respectful, dignified, and again, tailored. I'm also going to talk a little bit about best practices, ways that you can support Indigenous communities, and then how do we have some ongoing learning as we continue to support our survivors. So just a few definitions, because you might hear them throughout this presentation, is one, BIPOC. BIPOC stands for Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Indigenous is any group of people that is native to a specific region. And then intersectionality is really just the acknowledgement that everyone has their own unique experiences when it comes to discrimination and oppression. And so we must consider that these experiences affect marginalized people when it comes to gender, race, class, sexual orientation, physical ability, etc. So now let's talk a little bit about sexual assault and the BIPOC and Indigenous communities. So sexual assault is definitely a deeply distressing and pervasive issue that affects individuals across all communities, right? But we know that it impacts BIPOC and Indigenous communities in a particularly profound and complex way. So studies have shown that members of BIPOC and Indigenous communities are at higher risk of experiencing sexual assault. However, underreporting within these communities often lead to statistics that underestimate the true extent of the problem. Then we have the historical trauma aspect of sexual assault. So historical trauma in these communities stemming from colonization, forced assimilation, systematic discrimination has left lasting scars on these communities. So sexual assault can be perceived as a continuation of this trauma, right? It intensifies that psychological and emotional impact on survivors. And then we have intersectionality. So BIPOC and Indigenous survivors often face intersectional challenges related to their identities. So factors such as race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, and even disability intersects can create unique vulnerabilities and barriers to accessing support and justice. Tackle that on with cultural stigma, right? So cultural factors and the fear of stigmatization within these communities can also discourage survivors from reporting or seeking help. This stigma may arise from concerns about community judgment, mistrust of authorities, or cultural insensitivity within institutions. Then you have lack of accessibility to resources. So limited access to culturally sensitive support services can either further isolate a survivor. So lack of resources and language barriers can make it difficult for survivors to access the assistance that they need. Then you have systematic inequalities. So systematic inequalities includes disparities in healthcare, education, economic opportunities. All of these can make the impact on sexual assault and BIPOC and Indigenous survivors communities even harder. These disparities can hinder their ability to recover and heal. And then the last portion is community resilience. So despite these challenges, BIPOC and Indigenous communities often demonstrate incredible resilience and strength in face of sexual assault due to their cultural traditions, collective support, and healing practices playing a crucial role in survivors' journeys towards recovery. So now I want to talk about the prevalence of sexual assault in the United States. So according to the CDC, we know that sexual assault affects millions, right? Over half of women and almost 1 in 3 men have experienced sexual violence, including physical contact during their lifetimes. We know that 1 in 4 women and about 1 in 26 men have experienced completed or attempted rape. About 1 in 9 men were made to penetrate someone during his lifetime. Additionally, 1 in 3 and about 1 in 9 men experience sexual harassment in a public place. More than 4 in 5 female rape survivors reported that they were first raped before the age of 25. Almost half were first raped as minors, so before the age of 18. Nearly 8 in 10 male rape survivors reported that they were made to penetrate someone before the age of 25. About 4 in 10 were first made to penetrate as a minor. And we know in recent estimates that the lifetime cost of rape in the United States of America is literally over $122 million per survivor. This is including medical costs, loss of productivity, criminal justice activities, and any other costs related to sexual assault. So now I want to tap into getting an understanding of the concept of cultural humility. As I mentioned before, we have started to shift away from cultural competence and now into cultural humility. So the term cultural humility was first introduced in 1998 as a dynamic and lifelong process focusing on self-reflection and personal critique and acknowledging one's own biases. It recognizes the shifting nature of intersecting identities and encourages ongoing curiosity rather than an endpoint. So cultural humility involves understanding the complexities of identity, that even in the sameness, there is still difference. And so our goal as advocates, those who support survivors, is to really be fully competent in understanding how culture, how intersectionality, how multiple identities really evolve the human experience. So why is cultural humility, or what does cultural humility really look like? Well, it looks like a few things. One, it looks like building trust, right? So when we take a cultural humility approach, we want to foster trust and rapport between the service providers and these individuals with diverse backgrounds. So this looks like communicating respect for each other's unique identity and experiences. It also looks like avoiding stereotypes and biases. So as a service provider, as someone who is working with survivors, we have to be willing to recognize our own challenges and our own stereotypes and biases. This is going to help us begin to promote equity and unbiased care. It also looks like enhanced communication, right? So as we're beginning to understand cultural nuances in our communication, it's important that we begin to pay attention to nonverbal cues, language preferences, right? This helps to facilitate effective and respectful interactions. It also looks like tailoring our support. So cultural humility allows for support that is tailored to the individual's needs. It's incorporating their cultural beliefs and their practices into their care plan. This also looks like improving health outcomes. So in healthcare and support services, cultural humility can lead to better health outcomes by addressing cultural factors that impact well-being. It also looks like promoting inclusivity. So when we are culturally humility, we can contribute to creating inclusive environments where people from all backgrounds feel welcome, feel valued, and feel safe. And then lastly, it looks like the advancement of social equity. Being culturally informed and providing culturally informed care and support are essential for advancing social equity and dismantling systematic disparities that oftentimes affect marginalized communities. So let's talk a little bit about the challenges and risks of stereotypes and biases. So we know that stereotypes and biases play a huge role as to why BIPOC and Indigenous communities really struggle with reaching out for support. And that is because of some of these challenges that we're about to talk about. One, it perpetuates inequality, right? So stereotypes and biases definitely perpetuate existing inequalities and existing systematic disparities. It reinforces those negative perceptions regarding marginalized communities. So this can oftentimes lead to unequal treatment in various aspects of life, including education, employment, and the criminal justice system. It also looks like diminished access to resources. So our biases can limit access to essential resources and services for BIPOC and Indigenous communities. This affects their overall well-being and quality of life. And again, this can look like access to healthcare, housing, educational opportunities. It also can cause psychological harm. So stereotypes and biases can cause psychological harm to the individuals within these communities. This, again, raises that awareness of feeling judged and feeling treated unfairly based on stereotypes. This oftentimes leads them to feeling stressed, anxious, and even have decreased self-esteem. It also plays a factor in reporting. So it's a barrier to why underreporting is huge in these communities, right? When it comes to sexual assault, stereotypes and biases can discourage survivors from reporting the incidents, right? Fear of not being believed or being subjected to further discrimination can prevent survivors from seeking help. Then we have the distrust in institutions, right? So bias within institutions oftentimes leaves survivors feeling unprotected and unsupported. And so this distrust can literally deter an individual from seeking assistance, whether that's from law enforcement, healthcare providers, or support services. We also have the cultural insensitivity, right? So bias and stereotypes can lead to cultural insensitivity in service provision. Providers may not fully understand or even respect cultural beliefs, practices, and preferences of BIPOC and Indigenous individuals. And oftentimes that results in inadequate healthcare and support. And then the last challenge is that it hinders the healing process. So when biases and stereotypes are in play, it can hinder the healing process for survivors by creating that additional emotional and psychological trauma, which leads survivors to question whether they're worthy of support and their ability to actually overcome trauma. So now I want to talk a little bit about the underreporting. So sexual assault, we know again as a whole, deeply is a concerning issue that affects individuals in BIPOC and Indigenous communities, right? And so we know through studies that members of these communities are, again, at a higher risk of experiencing sexual violence. However, it is also crucial to acknowledge that the reporting statistics significantly underestimate the true extent of the problem due to underreporting. And so underreporting comes with the historical factors, the systematic inequalities, the cultural stigma, the fear of being a part of the justice system. All of these things play a role in why, specifically within BIPOC and Indigenous communities, we have underreporting, right? So we have seen that survivors have unique barriers when it comes to disclosure. They have mistrust with the authorities, right? They are concerned about cultural insensitivity in the justice system. They're concerned about being further victimized in the system as well as in their communities. So it is important that we understand how this underreporting really plays a role in why we need to create more culturally informed care and support for survivors within these communities. When we begin to address the underreporting issue and begin to provide culturally sensitive services, we can work towards creating safer and more inclusive spaces where survivors feel empowered to seek help and seek healing. So let's talk a little bit about reporting and underreporting. So again, we know sexual assault as a whole is underreported, right? We know that there are many, many survivors, regardless of the communities that they're in, that do not report when they have been sexually assaulted. But I want to really focus on how it looks in communities of color as well as Indigenous communities. So in communities of color, sexual assault is even more underreported. So statistics have shown that for every Black woman who reports rape, at least 15 Black women do not report. We also know that 1 in 4 Black girls will be sexually abused before the age of 18. We also know that 35% of Black women experience some form of sexual contact and sexual violence during their lifetime. And we also know that 40 to 60% of Black women report being subjected to coercive sexual contact by the age of 18. Now, in Indigenous communities, sexual assault is also very underreported. And so statistics have shown us that on average, American Indians ages 12 and older experience 5,900 sexual assaults per year. We also know that American Indians are twice as likely to experience rape or sexual assault compared to all other races. We also know that 41% of sexual assaults against American Indians are committed by a stranger. We know that 34% of sexual assault against American Indians are committed by an acquaintance. And then we also know that 25% of sexual assaults against American Indians are committed by an intimate or family member. So now I want to touch a little bit about intersectionality. So again, intersectionality is really a concept that regarding individuals' identity, right? So it is the concept that is shaped by getting us to understand the combination of various factors that make up a person. So we're looking at race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, disability, and socioeconomic status. When it comes to sexual assault within BIPOC and Indigenous communities, it is so important that we understand intersectionality and how it plays a crucial role in the complex and multifaceted experiences that our survivors are facing. So what does this actually look like? What does intersectionality and identity really look like in these communities? Well, one, it is multi-layered identities, right? So individuals within BIPOC and Indigenous communities often hold multiple intersecting identities. So for example, a survivor might identify with being both Indigenous and LGBTQ+, or they might identify as being a person with a disability. So It's multi-layered identities that influences their experience with sexual assault and the support that they may need. It also looks a little like the unique vulnerabilities. So when we are dealing with individuals with intersectionality, it creates unique vulnerabilities. For example, LGBTQ plus members may face discrimination not for only their sexual orientation, but also for their racial or ethnic background. So these compound forms of discrimination can increase the risk of sexual assault and complicate the healing process. Again, it looks like cultural sensitivity. So cultural factors play a significant role in how survivors navigate their experiences. BIPOC and Indigenous LGBTQ plus survivors, for example, may encounter cultural stigma and family dynamics that differ from the mainstream norms. This, again, will impact their willingness to report or even seek support. And then you have disability considerations. So those that have disabilities, whether visible or invisible, can intersect with other aspects of identity. Disabled survivors may face barriers to accessing services, communicating their experiences, or receiving accommodations that address their unique needs. Then we look like trauma and resilience. So intersectionality also plays a role in how individuals respond to trauma and build resilience, right? So this looks like their cultural practices, the community support, the empowerment of diverse communities that really can help contribute to a survivor's healing journey. And then lastly, it looks like inclusive support. So recognizing the intersecting identities of survivors is essential to providing that inclusive and culturally competent but culturally humble support. Service providers, we must be sensitive to the unique challenges that are faced by not only our LGBTQ plus, but also our BIPOC and our Indigenous survivors, as well as those with disabilities. So here are some cultural considerations that I want us to think about, okay? Cultural considerations is going to be paramount when we're providing support to sexual assault survivors within BIPOC and Indigenous communities. These communities encompass such a rich tapestry of diverse belief systems, practices, and traditions that are profoundly influence how individuals experience and cope with trauma. It is important that we take a look at cultural considerations not only as a sign of respect, but also a practicing of the necessity that they need to feel supported within BIPOC and Indigenous communities. So what does cultural considerations look like for them? Well, one, it's the diverse belief systems, right? So many members of BIPOC and Indigenous communities often hold a wide range of spiritual and religious beliefs. When we are culturally sensitive, we're respecting and acknowledging those belief systems. We're understanding that they may play a pivotal role in their coping mechanism and their healing process. It also looks like traditional practices, right? So cultural practices and rituals can provide a source of strength and resilience for survivors. These practices may include storytelling, ceremonies, dances, other traditions that have been passed down through their generations. Recognizing and honor these traditions, again, can be instrumental in the survivor's recovery. It also looks like the role that elders and healers play, right? So we know in a lot of these communities, elders and traditional healers often hold significant positions of trust and authority within these communities. Their guidance and support is oftentimes invaluable in helping survivors navigate the aftermath of sexual assault. So we want to be able to collaborate with them and respect their insight to these community figures and how it plays a role for these survivors. And then it looks like cultural trauma-informed care. So culturally informed care extends beyond just recognizing cultural practices. It also involves understanding the historical trauma that BIPOC and Indigenous communities have endured. So as a provider, we should be aware of the historical context and its impact on individuals' experiences of trauma and healing. And then lastly, cultural considerations looks like respect for autonomy. We must respect an individual's autonomy. As survivors, they have agency to choose whether or not to engage in any cultural practices or any traditions as a part of their healing journey. Again, being cultural sensitive means we're offering them options rather than imposing expectations. So now I want to talk about how we embrace a trauma-informed approach. So again, trauma-informed care is a combination of being culturally sensitive and cultural humility, right? And so it is paramount when providing support to communities of color and Indigenous communities who have experienced trauma and including sexual assault. So it looks like acknowledging that deep impact that trauma has on individuals and communities, fostering an environment of safety, trust, and understanding. Cultural humility ensures that supportive services are respectful of the diverse backgrounds, the values, the experiences, allowing survivors to feel heard and validated. So when we take this trauma-informed approach with cultural sensitivity and humility, it looks like we're now creating services that are recovery centered. So trauma-informed care prioritizes the survivor's recovery journey and acknowledges the profound impact of trauma and fostering an environment of safety, trust, and empowerment. It also looks like remaining culturally sensitive. So we're recognizing those intersectionality of identities and experiences within these communities, and we're ensuring that care and support are cultural sensitive, respectful, and responsive to their diverse needs. And then we're making sure that we're reducing re-traumatization. So trauma-informed approaches aim to prevent re-traumatization by minimizing those triggers and reestablishing a sense of control and agency for survivors. So now I want to talk a little bit about tailoring our services. So as service providers, it is going to be very important that we focus on how we tailor our services to meet the needs of these survivors. So one, it's recognizing and addressing those unique needs of sexual assault survivors within the BIPOC and Indigenous communities. Some of those needs are ensuring that we are, again, providing culturally sensitive support. They have access to community resources, and we're taking a trauma-informed approach with an intersectional lens. Also, tailoring our services ensures that survivors receive support that's respectful, inclusive, and responsive to their diverse backgrounds and experiences. This approach fosters a more effective and empathetic response. It promotes trust, it promotes healing, and it promotes resilience amongst survivors. So now I want to talk a little bit about how we support Indigenous communities specifically. So supporting Indigenous communities impacted by sexual assault requires, again, a multifaceted approach, right? Because we want to make sure that we're respecting their sovereignty, we're respecting cultural autonomy, and we're respecting those unique perspectives. So it is going to be important that we begin to partner with Indigenous organizations that help us to support Indigenous communities. This is how we begin to promote that cultural respect, right? Through just in things like land acknowledgements and any other essential steps that's going to help them in this process. We also want to be aware of sovereignty and cultural autonomy. In Indigenous communities in particular, they have distinct histories, traditions, and governance structures. So we want to recognize their sovereignty, right? This means that we're respecting their right to self-determination and autonomy over their own affairs. This also includes matters related to sexual assault support. This approach is going to empower communities to really define their needs and their priorities. And then lastly, we want to partner with Indigenous organizations. So collaborating with Indigenous-led organizations and agencies is vital. because these organizations often have a deeper understanding of the cultural, historical, and systematic factors that play a role in how we can provide culturally informed services, advocacy, and resources that are essential for supporting survivors. So here are some best practices when working with survivors in BIPOC and Indigenous communities. Number one, again, let's be culturally sensitive. Again, being culturally sensitive means that we are being respectful. We are open to survivors' beliefs, practices, and traditions. We avoid making assumptions about their experiences based on cultural backgrounds. Number two, we take a trauma-informed approach. So we adapt a trauma-informed approach that prioritizes safety, trust, and empowerment, recognizing the potential impact of trauma on survivors and provide that support accordingly. Number three, we become culturally humbled and culturally sensitive providers. So we ensure that as service providers that we are not only culturally competent and trained to address these unique needs of our survivors within these communities, but we also get an understanding of what intersectionality looks like and diverse identities looks like in these communities. Number four, collaboration. So we begin to collaborate with other organizations in Indigenous-led Indigenous communities, BIPOC communities, right? We partner with them so that we can, again, have an understanding of how culture plays a role in how support needs to be provided for these survivors. And then lastly, if needed, language access. So we want to make sure that in our organizations that we are providing any type of language access, whether that's interpreters, translated materials, anything that's going to help build that bridge between language barriers and providing effective communication with survivors. And so that concludes this training on culturally informed care. If there are any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat or come off mute, and I'll toss it back over to you, Alyssa.
Thank you so much for that presentation. So I'd like to direct everyone's attention to the chat. I just posted the evaluation form. Again, as I said before, we are constantly striving to improve our training programs and appreciate all feedback that you provide. Additionally, if you're seeking a certificate of attendance or CEU credit, you must fill out the evaluation form. You'll receive your certificates within 3 to 4 weeks. If you have any questions, go ahead and pop that in the chat now, or you can email Leah for follow-up. Thank you so much.